Well, good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'm Jules Salinas with Women Food and Agriculture Network. Wanted to just welcome everybody to the webinar today. We have a great panel of speakers, and I know that it can be challenging during the summer to make time to do this, so we really appreciate you coming. The session will be interpreted. Si necesita interpretación en español, haga clic en el globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Luego seleccione español y escuchará la transmisión simultánea del webinar interpretada por Orlando Acevedo. Agradecemos a Rolando por unirse a nosotros hoy y a nuestros patrocinadores, incluye la Fundación de Agricultura Regenerativa, por apoyar el acceso al idioma. So thank you. If you need Spanish interpretation, you can click the bottom globe and choose Spanish. And it is being interpreted today by Rolando Acevedo. We have huge thanks to Rolando for joining us today, and to our funders, including the Foundation for Regenerative Agriculture, for providing access in Spanish. We would like you to please include your name and pronouns and organization using Zoom rename feature. Right click on your picture, select rename at the bottom of the selections, and put in your name and pronouns and organization. And then just wanted to quickly go over the Zoom, our WFAN community guidelines. It's one person, one mic, one person speaks at a time. No one knows everything. Together we know a lot. Move up, move up. If you tend not to speak a lot, please move up into the role of speaking more. If you tend to speak a lot, please move back into the role of listening more. The up confirms that both experiences growth is happening, and choosing to learn how to listen moves both you and the group up. And we can't be articulate all the time. I am proof of that. Some people feel hesitant to participate in a workshop or meeting for fear of messing up or stumbling over their words, but it's totally normal, and we want everyone to feel comfortable in participating, even if you don't feel like you have the perfect words to express your thoughts. We want to center a culture of care. Let's lift each other up. And be active inquiry. There's going to be a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, and we would ask that folks be active in their inquiry about how your personal identities and positions within hierarchies of privilege impact and influence others in collective space. So thank you so much, and I'm going to hand this over to Piper now. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jules, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. It's really nice to see so many other folks. It's kind of hazy here in northeastern Iowa on account of the wildfires, and it's just nice to be in community when you can't really go outside right now. So I will jump into our speaker introductions, and I just wanted to let folks know that I dropped our community guidelines in the chat as well if you're interested in reading those over throughout the session. But I will start with introducing our speakers today. So this is the second of our four-part series on the Farm Bill, the 2023 Farm Bill, and understanding how we can work together collectively to build a better Farm Bill. And our first session centered on farm worker rights, and that is actually available now on our YouTube page. So I will just link that at the end of our session today. But this will be a discussion with folks from policy organizations working to build a better Farm Bill through advocacy and action. So I'll introduce Lisa Griffith, who is our first speaker today. Lisa is the National Outreach and Communications Coordinator for the National Family Farm Coalition, NFFC, a coalition of 30 grassroots farm, ranch, and fishing organizations striving for a just food and farm system. Prior to joining NFFC in 2007, she worked in Chicago in organizations advancing community access to garden spaces, creating affordable housing, and an economic development. Lisa comes from a small farm in northeastern Missouri, holds an urban planning and anthropology degrees, and strives to uplift pollinators and local food producers with her husband on lands that have been formerly occupied and unceded by the Cahokia, Kickapoo, Casaccia, and Shawnee peoples, among others in southern Illinois. And I will turn it over to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Piper. And thanks to the Women in Food and Agriculture Network for inviting me to speak today on behalf of Farm Bill, Advocacy and Action as NFFC sees it this year. It's really an honor to be here with all of you, including Ariana from National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and Rolando providing interpretation for us. Next slide, please. NFFC was founded in January of 1986 as a result of farmers who had gathered several years before during tractorcades to Washington, D.C. To fight for a parity commodity prices. And those prices would mean that there would be no taxpayer subsidies required. They also wanted a sound environmental farming practices to be supported and promoted, and that included supply management as one of those. So we were formed, as I said, in January of '86, and then later that year, the United Farmer and Rancher Congress met in September, and it was quite an amazing event. There is a really excellent story about it. And actually the report from it at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy website. I put the link there in the chat if anyone wants to take a screenshot or check it out. It's just a very comprehensive document with composed by, I think it was about 1,500 delegates from around the country who had come together. They'd been actually elected at local elections and came together to address all kinds of issues, not just price and supply management and conservation, but also Black farmer and Native American access to land. So it serves kind of as a bedrock of our work today. Later that year in the next year in 1987, NFFC helped to pass the Agricultural Credit Act of that year. And that saved a number of farmers, about 70,000 farmers, from foreclosure, which had been happening through the late 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, about 250,000 farmers did go out of business during that time, and over 1,200 male and female farmers, farm workers, and farm children committed suicide. So it was a very dire time, but we were honored to be part of the effort to try to assuage that situation. Next slide, please. By 1990, we had added a third focus to our work, and that was to redress Black land loss and racial discrimination. And in I'm assuming 89 and then 90, we helped to pass with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Land Loss Prevention Project, and Rural Coalition, the Minority Farmers' Rights Act of 1990. That's now referred to as Section 2501 program for outreach and assistance for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. That was first funded in the 1992 Farm Bill and has been funded ever since. So later in the 1990s, we were protesting free trade, as some of you might remember. NAFTA was passed, I think, in 94 or 5, and a group of somewhat radical activists met in Seattle at the WTO, a World Trade Organization ministerial meeting in late 1999. And that's where NFFC met a lot of great organizers, including some who have become NFFC members since, as well as the International Peasant Organization, La Via Campesina, which was demanding that agriculture be removed from World Trade Organization negotiations. That was really key because I think it woke us, a lot of folks in the US up to what was happening worldwide, and that what was happening in the US, first of all, influenced what was happening worldwide to farmers around the country, around the world, excuse me, but also that we weren't alone in this. And so by being influential, we could be influential both from a negative and a positive way, from the standpoint of the corporate influence that has been so harmful, but also to the organizational aspect and gathering people's energy together to fight for the good. So not long after that, NFFC joined Olivia Campesina as the first U.S. member, and then adopted the 7 principles of food sovereignty. Next slide, please. This is just a picture from some good folks at the 2014 People's Climate March in New York. And to the left there is our former longtime vice president and representative to Olivia Campesina, Adina Hoff, who's an organic farmer from Northern Plains Resource Council in Montana. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of NFFC's 2007 Food from Family Farms Act. This was a proposal we drafted for the 07, which became 08 Farm Bill. And it was focused on the commodity title. And it was drafted in part because everyone needs to eat. And farming is so important and so unpredictable. One study of the Food from Family Farms Act revealed that in comparison to the US Farm Bill, the prices that farmers received for 5 major commodities would have increased 16 to 37%, while the taxpayer cost of farm subsidies dropped by 57%. So it was, as I note there, taxpayer and family friendly, focused on commodity price floors, a parity price with restoring grain reserves so that we could have an even supply for the demand of grain, and that prices wouldn't be gouged if there was a bad year or two. Supply management strategies were important, as well as strong conservation measures. Unfortunately, it was not introduced in Congress. Next slide, please. Another highlight, I would say, is that in 2018, we had a new director. Our longtime director, Kathy Ozer, had passed in 2017, and Niaz Dori began a shared leadership model with her other organization, Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, now North American Marine Alliance. And we began with our members a year-long strategic planning process. And this helped to solidify the focus and goals of our work for the next 5 or so years. And goal number 1 was to achieve more fair and equitable prices for people who grow, harvest, catch, process, and transport food. In particular, we see the dairy sector in crisis, and then this became an example for us and a focus for this particular goal. Goal 2 was that independent food providers should be free of corporate control, because we know they suffer the most from mergers, concentration, and other aspects of food injustice. And we also know that corporate controlled resources, markets, and prices removes community wealth, as well as growers from the land and fishermen from the water. Next slide, please. Sorry, just lost my place. Okay. So today we look at, why is the 2023 Farm Bill so important? We drafted our 2023 Farm Bill platform to explain and address these issues. Next slide. We see this moment as one for political change to redress and end the harms of corporate consolidation, which certainly became apparent during the 3-year pandemic, which is not entirely over, I would say, but certainly we are in a better place than we were 3 years ago at this time. But some issues that and long-time concerns and results of corporate consolidation include monocrop farming, which has led to soil erosion and water pollution. Land, seeds, water rights, and other resources are more expensive. Producer prices and worker wages are lower. Local businesses have closed, and consumer choice and tax bases have decreased. One example, again, looking at the dairy sector, is that in 1970, the U.S. dairy farmer count was at 648,000. Last year, the total number was at 27,932. I think that's about 5% or so left. Today, 5% of the dairy operations produce 56% of our milk. So I think it's pretty easy to see how consolidation has happened there and the effects of that. And particularly in areas, if you are from Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Vermont, other Northeast states, any place where you had local creameries and local dairies, you'll see probably a big change there. Next slide, please. So one proposal that we have developed for our Farm Bill platform, which has not yet been introduced, but we still think it has a lot of, there's time yet, and we feel very strongly about it as not necessarily the perfect solution to the dairy crisis, but one that offers a lot of intel, because it was based on conversations with dairy farmers, some who had retired and some who were still milking cows. But as you may know, as the numbers tell us, dairy farms have been closing at an alarming rate. And this affects the farms, of course, the farm and worker families, their communities, and the environment. Decentralizing dairy production and fair price standards for producers would bring family-scale dairy farms and regional processors back to rural areas, thereby increasing economic activity across many sectors. Regional dairy and regional food, local foods in general, production is also more transparent and resilient, as we saw during that pandemic. NFFC's plan would pay dairy farmers a huge wage based on their cost of production, providing huge taxpayer savings, and incentivize family-scale dairy farms, offering a consistent supply of regional milk for processors and for consumers. And as we show there, the pillars of the reforms would be a balanced national milk supply and demand, a guaranteed fair price for milk, control of dairy imports and exports. It would address the high level of consolidation and rebuild regional dairy production and processing infrastructure through programs such as a local area market program and apprenticeships. Next slide, please. Another issue that we see around the country is what new landless, young, and historically underserved farmers are facing. And that is about 40% of US farmland, and that's roughly 400 million acres, are expected to change hand in the next 20 to 30 years. Black farmers have lost about 90% or more than 12 million acres since 1910. Part of this is through abuse of their heirs' property ownership, lender theft, and discrimination at USDA. Another aspect of this loss of land is corporate and pension fund investment, especially since the 2008-9 economic crisis. And this has caused the land price in some regions to just skyrocket, totally out of reach. Today, US cropland averages about $5,050 per acre, and all farmland averaging about $3,800 per acre. But we have seen reports from 2021 stating that New Jersey land is at $15,900 per acre. This is farmland. California, $15,410 per acre. Iowa over $9,000, Delaware over $9,000, and Illinois about $8,950 per acre. So obviously, very few new beginning and landless farmers would have this kind of capital to buy land. And similar situation for Black families who've lost generational wealth for decades. Next slide, please. You'll see at the back of the truck, it's not a very good photo of him, and unfortunately, but a longtime president, Ben Burkett, he has also served for many years as the Mississippi Association of Farmers State Coordinator and was a longtime president of NFFC. He's also a very dear friend and an excellent farmer. should you ever have time to spend with him. He's with another Mississippi Association farmer. They're loading eggplant for a farmer's market. They sell at the New Orleans farmer's market, among other places. Next slide, please. So Farm Bill 2023, we think, is very important to strengthen land access for historically underserved producers and family members. The bill that we are looking at and would include some ideas, concepts such as public funding of community-based land tenure, such as agrarian trusts and land commons, tracking, oversight, and limits on corporate farmland ownership, increased as assistance to heirs property owners, indigenous and native land tenure programs, and we expect it to be known as the Farmland for Farmers Act, hopefully introduced later this year for the Farm Bill. Next slide, please. Another issue of the 2023 Farm Bill is that we feel it's an important opportunity to make agriculture credit more accessible and equitable. Therefore, we could have more farmers farming. The U.S. farm sector debt has become has risen more than to be over $535.1 billion. Land, equipment, seeds, of course, and other essential input costs are rising steadily. The Farm Service Agency is the only lending option for some, and it offers often better lending terms, but there's a long history of racial discrimination there. Some of you might remember reading or knowing about the Pickford 1 and 2 settlements in which the government paid $2.5 billion to farmers who had been able to prove discrimination from the Farm Services Agency. And that's just, I think there are many farmers whose settlements never reached them or whose applications were denied. So not to say that this amount of money actually took care of everything, but it was an attempt. Unfortunately, we know that Black farmers still are denied loans sometimes, and that certain FSA offices do not practice with transparency. So it's an ongoing problem for Black farmers and other people of color farmers. The other issue that we see here is that family farm foreclosures also mean the loss of homes and livelihoods. Next slide, please. So to address this, we are working with on a bill that would provide and improve agriculture credit access for historically underserved producers and family farmers by extending the farm foreclosure moratorium that was in place during the pandemic, loan restructuring and FSA lending eligibility, limiting over collateralization such as houses, expanding equitable relief from Farm Service Agency errors, and ensuring that FSA loan access is available to heirs property owners. Next slide, please. So a recent study concluded that USDA discrimination has likely contributed to $326 billion of lost Black wealth. So we would expect that debt relief payments would help to rebuild the rural communities and rural economies that have faltered during that lost wealth, during those periods, and also that community trust in federal policy could be rebuilt, including USDA's approach to policy implementation. Next slide, please. The Farm Bill 2023 should include equitable implementation of USDA debt relief. In particular, we would hope to see that the Inflation Reduction Act farmer debt relief payments would be exempt from federal taxes, including income tax. The 2022 Inflation Reduction Act included $5.3 billion in debt relief for economically distressed farmers and ranchers who face discrimination, while also regrettably removing the framing or language about racial discrimination. So we would like to see this addressed. And those are the 4 main priorities of our Farm Bill platform, which you would find at our website. Next slide, please. So to summarize a bit, the bills that we are promoting most highly right now are 3 that we have been working or have worked on and which have not yet been introduced. The Milk from Family Dairies Act, the Fair Credit for Farmers Act, the Farmland for Farmers Act, as well as the recently introduced Increasing Land Success, Access, Security, and Opportunities Act, and the American Beef Labeling Act, providing mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. And these are by no means all the bills that we support or endorse. These are the ones that our members have determined at this point are the most necessary, the ones needing support right now, because as you can see, 3 of them have not yet been introduced. So we would hope that folks can help us. And if we go to the final slide, please. There's some opportunities here to visit our website, our Facebook page, our Instagram account, Twitter account. My email address is there if you'd like to contact me in the future. We ask you to act. These are really important times, as we said, and I think all of you agree, if you're here, that it's important. We all need to eat. We all need people who grow and harvest and catch and process and transport of food. And we want to support them as much as possible and hope that you will be able to do so as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing. I really appreciate just the being able to kind of ground us in the history of the work that you all have done and the coalitions that you have been a part of building, and really appreciate just such a thorough understanding of kind of where we need the most support right now. I am going to, sorry, I think there's a bit of an echo. There we go. I'm going to pass things over to our second speaker for today, Ariana Taylor Stanley, who comes to us from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Ariana serves as the grassroots co-director of NSAC, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and also co-owns and operates Here We Are Farm, located in Trumansburg, New York, which grows vegetables for CSAs and farmers markets, along with a small sheep silvopasture operation. Ariana is active in her community and is part of several grassroots racial justice and food sovereignty projects. And we really appreciate you being here. And I'll just give a quick mention, if folks have questions, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, and I would invite you all to kind of hold on to those questions and put them in the chat if possible, and we will get to those at the end of the session today. But I will go ahead and turn things over to Ariana to bring us some news from NSAC.
Thanks so much, Piper, and just lots of appreciation to Lisa for that really thorough look at the movement history over the past 35 years. That was really incredible wealth of knowledge. Thanks so much for sharing that with all of us. And yes, it's great to be here with all of you. Thank you for the introduction, Piper. When you get a moment, can you throw my slides on the screen?
Yes, I'm battling a taskbar, but I will.
Okay.
I will.
Thank you.
I will
Awesome.
Get those up for you. Just one second.
Fantastic. I can dive in a little bit. Actually, maybe before I do much more introducing on myself and my organization, I'm curious to know a little bit about the folks who are here on the live call. Oh, thank you so much. Awesome. Yeah, I wonder who we have in the room. Let me see. I'm going to fix my screen now so I can see you all better. Curious how many of you are farmers, people who are currently farming or hoping to be or used to be. I don't know. You can raise your actual hand, or you could do the little hand emoji of some sort. You could put in the chat. Any farmers on the line? How about people in the academic world, students or other academic folks? Okay, what about farm service? Okay, got one. Nice, thanks. Hey, how about like farm service provider type folks? Extension, there's such. Yeah, okay, I got at least one of those. Awesome. Oh, and then I'm seeing in the chat, thanks for throwing in the chat. There's urban farmer. Awesome. What else? I'm curious to hear what other reasons have brought you here. How about how many of you already consider yourselves advocates for better farm policy? And maybe some folks are also multitasking. Hard to do both things, but awesome. Yeah, seeing some hands. Glad to have advocates in the room. And if you have, I'm curious to just know more about all of you so that I can try and provide info that feels relevant. So please feel free to also throw in the chat any other like bits of introduction that you think might be helpful. It's nice to know who's here. But I will dive in. So as Piper said, my name is Ariana. And so I farm in central New York State on Diacono territory, also known as Trumansburg, New York. But I'm here today in my capacity as grassroots co-director of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Can you click to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which goes by the acronym of NSAC, is an alliance of organizations like the Women, Food, and Agriculture Network and many others around the country who provide services to farmers. They are mostly like direct farmer serving organizations, but want to have a voice in federal policy. And we have a very similar, we trace our history actually to a very similar timeline as NFFC. So yes, also about 35-year-old organization and there for many of the same battles. Yeah, before we dive in, I wanted to provide one just piece of context that was super present in everything that Lisa just shared on our next slide. Which is the reality that agriculture in this country is built on a legacy of stolen Indigenous land and stolen African labor. And what that means for this conversation is that any policy that we talk about that isn't deliberately working to dismantle this legacy of racism is going to act to uphold and perpetuate it. So we'll return to this, but I wanted to frame our conversation with this reality. So I'm gonna talk a little bit in detail with you all about what the Farm Bill is itself. So we're gonna do a little bit of background on that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what folks in the NSAC world want to see change, so some priorities that we have. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some actions that you can take to engage in that work and advocate for change in the next Farm Bill. So next slide, please. So this is very fast. There's a lot to talk about in the Farm Bill, but I'm going to try and go quickly through this bit so we can talk more about what we're doing about it. And you probably already gleaned quite a bit of this from what Lisa shared. But, you know, if I were to break it down into 3 pieces to take away from this conversation, they might be that it is big. It's a big bill. It is complicated and sometimes contradictory, and it is being rewritten. So it is timely. So we'll just talk about each of those really quickly. Next slide, please. So the Farm Bill is the cute nickname we have for the biggest piece of U.S. food and farm policy. It is not the only place in federal policy that agriculture decisions get made about agriculture, but it is certainly the biggest one. And because it is so vast, so comprehensive, it contains so much money, allocates so much money, and affects the entire country, including our territories, it is a little bit of change. So even when we make incremental changes, they can go a long way. We like to make really big transformative changes. And sometimes we only get smaller wins, and either of those can be very, very impactful. So it is a critical opportunity. And speaking of critical opportunities, next slide, please. So it's being rewritten right now. And this is a silly graphical representation of this very wonky piece of why the Farm Bill is being rewritten. So the most recent Farm Bill, which was passed in 2018, was authorized for about 5 years. So it was authorized only until the end of this fiscal year, which ends at the end of September. And so theoretically, major parts of the Farm Bill, if it were not to be renewed, if a new one doesn't get passed, will expire then. And theoretically, that means that the last Farm Bill without an expiration date, which was passed in the 1940s, would go back into effect, because dairy policy was very different in the 1940s. That would dramatically change current dairy policy. And so some people call it the dairy cliff. So that's what that picture is. Basically what this means is we have a key opportunity this year to write a new Farm Bill, to be part of the process of rewriting this major influential piece of agriculture policy and advocating for important changes in that new bill. So what is in that bill? Next slide, please. Oh, wait, right, sorry, one more piece of context for you here. So this is kind of an oversimplification of what it looks like to get from here to there. So there, like any piece of legislation that passes through Congress, it goes through committees, it goes through each chamber of Congress, and then it gets eventually signed into law by the president. So we are up at the top here. We are the agriculture committees who write the Farm Bill are just beginning that process. That process, to be honest with you, is a little bit behind schedule. That's worth knowing, especially because I just said that the old Farm Bill expires in September. To be frank, we don't feel very confident that we will actually see a new Farm Bill by the time the old Farm Bill expires in September. What that could look like is like something from Congress just sort of scrambling and eventually getting one together soon after, to an extension of the current Farm Bill, which could be for a few months to even longer. That's all up to Congress. So we will likely have this process continue longer than Congress is currently acknowledging that it will, which means for us as advocates that we actually have a bit longer window of opportunity to affect changes, to introduce and support pieces of legislation that might end up in the Farm Bill, like the ones Lisa was speaking about. So we'll be up at that first phase of the committees drafting the bill until we see that draft bill, which could be sort of any day, but more likely to be like later in the summer to September, or even later than that. So let's talk about what is in that bill. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the Farm Bill is, well, we talked about it's big. It's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money for agriculture. But when you look at this breakdown, this pie chart that breaks down Farm Bill spending, you might notice that the biggest section of this chart actually is nutrition spending, which is obviously related because this is funding that goes to people to buy food, and food comes from farms at some level. But this is more, the fact that this is such a large percentage of the Farm Bill spending, I think says more about the levels of poverty and income inequality in this country than anything else. And of course, yes, this is intricately linked to our agriculture system. This pie chart shows us where some of the funding that does go more directly to farmers and people serving farmers, where it goes. And there is a bit of nuance and even some contradiction in what you see in terms of this funding allocation, because there are programs here represented, like there's a slice of this pie you can see that funds conservation programs. And this is the result of tireless advocacy on the part of folks like you over generations that said, hey, we need support for farmers to implement conservation. We need support for our stewardship practices when the economy, itself is not like, when just the prices I'm going to get in the market aren't going to necessarily incentivize me to do great stewardship. We need public support for good on-farm stewardship. So that's why we have farm conservation programs that pay farmers to do really cool, really impactful, important stewardship, and even implement climate-friendly farming practices that help us in addressing the climate crisis. On the other, and there are also many other things that are in this little 1% slice that I want to talk to you about more, that are also like really powerful tools for helping build a food system that will help regenerate and support our environmental goals, help address climate change, help farmers to be successful on the land, help them grow food that can serve our communities, to help anyone who wants to be a farmer access those resources, help our farmers access their local markets sustainably, make sure research is applicable to sustainable farming practices. There's a lot of incredible things that all, like with conservation programs, are the result of tireless advocacy on the part of folks like you all. And at the same time, many Farm Bill dollars go to support the farm safety net, which is important to keep farmers on the land. The agricultural economy itself does not do that. Farmers aren't getting paid enough to necessarily continue to succeed using the practices that most of them do. So the government helps make up the difference through commodity programs and subsidized crop insurance. But the way that these programs are built at present tends to kind of incentivize the opposite of the programs we just spoke about, like our conservation programs. Like if your crop insurance won't cover you for planting a cover crop or waiting to seed based on weather patterns, like there are many unsustainable practices that, or even just growing at scale or growing a very limited set of commodity crops, because those are the ones that the programs work best for. All of those practices that farmers are incentivized to use because of the way that our federal policy is set up. And so there are sort of inherent contradictions in this pot of funding going at the same time to fund conservation programs as it goes to fund other programs that disincentivize farmers from implementing conservation practices on their land. And baked into all of this, we talked at the beginning about the fact that all of our the whole agricultural system is built on a racist legacy. And these programs, a few of them, thanks to the advocacy of folks, and Lisa talked about some of the history of some of the programs that were explicitly built to help farmers of color access federal agriculture programs. So there are those. In the 1% slice, we do have programs that are, like I said at the beginning, like explicitly built to address and dismantle systemic inequities. However, most of these programs are not. Not only are they often built so that like you're paid by acre, so the more acres you farm, the more money you receive, meaning that because of legacies of systemic racism, white farmers own a disproportionate amount of land. They're like white folks in this country make up like, about 60% of the population, but own like 96% of the land. And so programs that pay folks on a per acre basis will disproportionately benefit white farmers, even with no racial intent. But at the same time, USDA has a documented history of discrimination towards farmers of color. So not only are the programs sort of systemically on autopilot built to sort of like be neutral and uphold whatever system is in place, which happens to be one that favors white landowners, but at the same time, USDA also has a documented history of discrimination towards farmers of color. For example, and my next slide has a little bit of info on this if you want to do some more research. One great place to start in learning about that history is the lawsuit, a class action lawsuit that Black farmers filed against USDA, the lead plaintiff being Timothy Pigford, who's pictured here. Pigford versus Glickman is very Googleable. The Wikipedia page actually is a great place to start, just kind of to understand. There's also been some excellent recent podcasts on this topic. And there were other class action lawsuits of other communities that received racial discrimination on behalf of USDA. But the bottom line is that USDA ended up paying a really huge historic settlement of millions of dollars to Black farmers who had gone to USDA offices seeking services and ended up with losing their land. And so add that history of explicit racism on the part of the people working in USDA offices into the context of how these programs operate. And we have, not only like a mistake, but also a huge legacy of violence to address. So what are we hoping to change in this Farm Bill? What kind of priorities do we hope to accomplish? So next slide, please. Well, from a sort of wide 20,000, 30,000 foot perspective, we want to sort of do three things. So when we looked at that pie chart, we noted that there are some things that advocates have worked so hard to win in the Farm Bill that are working well. There are programs that are funding farmers to do conservation. Like I get to use the conservation stewardship program on my land, and I'm talking to my USDA agent about how we can use that to build out my silvopasture, which is like a great climate-friendly practice that has lots of benefits from, carbon sequestration to hopefully helping me manage water and flooding in my field. So there's excellent programs like that and those that support like research to figure out how do we do, what do we fund? What is really working for smaller farms to help address the issues that they're facing and do sustainable and regenerative agriculture. There are great programs that help invest in local food systems, help farmers better reach their local communities and succeed as a business. All of these things are oversubscribed. More people apply every year for this funding than there is funding available. And so this is kind of an easy solution. Oh, give it more money. That will help these programs better serve more people because they already are working well. But we also just talked about the fact that these programs aren't necessarily serving everyone that they should be. That because of a wide, like a suite of problems that range from direct discrimination to just sort of like autopilot serving farmers with more land that have more land as the result of historic discrimination, that programs are not serving farmers of color as much as they should be. And so there are things we can do to change how these programs operate, to change things about the amount of like match funding you need to provide, and do you have to provide money up front, and is information offered in your language, and on to help improve access to programs that we know work well, and on top of that, supporting access to beginning farmers when it comes to even just having a place to farm, land and capital to farm with. And then there's this other sort of third category. So because we talked about things that are working well, we want to invest in them, we want to improve access to them, but there are also, we talked about things that are working less well. Farm programs that are currently, themselves are barriers to farmers necessarily engaging in sustainable practices. There are, the whole systems that are inaccessible to some farmers, and so sort of like incentivize a whole different scale of farming, as well as issues around competition. So this is sort of like the big picture overview of the kinds of changes we're hoping to see in this Farm Bill. And on the next slide, I will tell you about one special tool that we like to use when it comes to advocating for things like this. So we as advocates, love when we can get a marker bill introduced. And a marker bill, who knows what a marker bill is? Am I telling you information you already know? Okay, a marker bill is a piece of legislation. It's real legislation. It is introduced by a member of Congress. I, having not been elected to Congress, cannot introduce a marker bill as hard as I try. So it needs to be a member of Congress that introduces this legislation, and members of Congress other ones can support a marker bill, primarily by becoming a co-sponsor of that piece of legislation. And these bills rarely pass on their own. They're not really intended to ever come up to a vote, but rather they provide like a example language that members of Congress can basically copy and paste and add to a bigger bill that's going to be passed, for example, the Farm Bill. So when these bills are introduced, if we can get lots of support for them and lots of airtime, then sometimes, if we're successful, components of these bills may make their way into the final Farm Bill. And there are lots of marker bills that we are working on and support. There are lots that aren't even introduced yet. So we are working, we have a critical window. Congress is on recess for this week and next, but when they come back, we expect more bills like this to be introduced. And that will be a critical opportunity for engagement, because these bills can kind of take an issue. So the first one on the list is the Agricultural Resilience Act, which is focused on ways that the next Farm Bill could address climate change in ways that support small farmers in both like mitigating climate change, but also addressing it on their farms. And so it's like a bill that addresses one thing. So this way, if I as an advocate want Congress to address climate in the next Farm Bill, I don't just have to call and say, please address climate. You know, for example, like silvopasture is really cool and you should fund farmers like me for doing that. And also think about cover crops and also think about our conservation programs. And what about research? I don't have to like list all those things. I can say the Agricultural Resilience Act has a roadmap for addressing climate in the Farm Bill. Will you become a co-sponsor? So that's one example. And then because that particular marker bill is itself quite large and covers lots of different ways that that the next Farm Bill could address the climate crisis, members of Congress have also begun to introduce different pieces of it as standalone marker bills. And actually another one on this list, the Strengthening Local Processing Act, is sort of an example of that. This marker bill helps address bottlenecks in the meat processing industry. And if we like think back a few phases, small meat production, especially pasture-raised meat, can be an incredible alternative to the like confined animal feeding operation type of farm that produces meat that is a much bigger problem when it comes to the climate. So like by addressing meat processing bottlenecks, it helps both like small farmers economically and also helps support a solution to climate change. So that's another example. And one difference between that smaller bill and the Agricultural Resilience Act as a whole is just that the Strengthening Local Processing Act, it has bipartisan support, which can be extremely helpful, where the Agricultural Resilience Act, because it does call on Congress to invest a lot of money, has had trouble getting Republican support. So right now it only has Democratic co-sponsors. Another example of a marker bill, these three are all marker bills that NSEC like helped work with our partners in Congress before they were introduced. And the Local Farms and Food Act is another example of a bill that helps like support infrastructure for local food systems and help reduce barriers to folks applying for programs like the Local Agriculture Market Program and others. And this one also has bipartisan support. And these are certainly not the full list. I did not want to overwhelm you with a long list of legislation. A few others that we didn't directly co-author, but definitely support include the Justice for Black Farmers Act, which is intended to help address some of the discrimination that we just talked about that's happened historically and level the playing field for Black farmers. A very newly introduced Increasing Land Access Security and Opportunities Act, provide more opportunities for beginning farmers and farmers of color. And there are many others. I won't just give you a laundry list, but marker bills are a cool thing to know about. It's cool to know what they are because you're like, well, I don't get it. There's the farm bills coming, but now there's all these like 80 other little bills. What's the relationship? Well, these are sort of templates for policy that might end up in the final farm bill. I think it's great to know how they work as advocates so that when new ones come out, you can be poised and ready to tell your legislators how awesome they are and how you would like their support. So speaking of taking action and telling your legislators you'd like their support, this is the time. As these marker bills are introduced, this is an incredible moment to plug into advocating for a better farm bill. And I think the first step in doing that is to be organized, is to find an organization, to work with other folks that are in the know on what's happening and coordinating to strategically mobilize when there are windows of opportunity that we can really get something done. And you have already done the first step because you are here with the Women, Food, and Ag Network, which is one great place to plug in to get information like this and to stay in the loop. Presumably, if you found out about this webinar, you're on some sort of list, or you will be. I also invite folks, if you'd like, to join NSAC's list. We also do email updates. I'll put the link to do that. Hopefully that'll work in the chat. We will, for example, tell you when the next little piece of the Agriculture Resilience Act gets introduced, which is really going to happen quite soon. And you can be poised to engage. The power of collective action is really hard to overstate. We win when we act together. And there are lots of things we might call on you to do or that you can do to engage, everything from, just picking up the phone and making a call to your member of Congress's office and telling them you support or oppose something that's happening. That could be now in the marker bill phase, and as the process continues, it might look like a amendment, or it might look like the bill as a whole, whether it passes. But that's not the only way that you can engage. Another way that can be a really powerful way to connect with your legislators is to reach out. You can start with that phone call, but then ask to have a meeting with the staffer from that office that handles agriculture issues. And you can introduce yourself, you can tell your story, you can make an ask, and you can position yourself to sort of be a resource for that person moving ahead as the Farm Bill continues to move forward. And then a quick little email follow-up or even phone call to that person to say, hey, remember me? It's Ariana. We met back in June. And I just wanted to follow up because this new bill was introduced and I thought, your boss, I thought that my legislator might be interested in supporting. Do you think this might be something they would support? And that, coming from a known entity, is a little bit more powerful than just coming out of the blue on the phone. Both are valid and worthwhile, but that's something you can do. You can form that relationship as a constituent. You can also do that by showing up to local events. So a lot of members of Congress are back in the district this week doing town halls and events, and you can show up, put your question in the hopper, come and ask, hey, what are you thinking about climate in the next Farm Bill? Will you support the Agriculture Resilience Act or whatever it is that your priority issue is? And you can go further. You have more time. You want to really build that relationship, invite them to your farm or your farmer's market or whatever your work looks like. Invite them back to the district, get to know you and hear what's really happening on the ground. And there are way more, you can go even deeper. But I wanted to talk about one more little piece, which is like, what do you say in those conversations? What does that look like? So next slide, please. This is a great chance to think about like your story. Like, why should they listen to you? What's important about what you why did you could start by thinking about, why did you come to this webinar? Like, why are these issues of importance to you? And you can build out your story that way. So you can, this could be something that you say over the phone, over an email, at a town hall, in an elevator, if you want to think of it as a traditional elevator pitch. Or a colleague of mine just ended up on an airplane next to her member of Congress for a couple of hours and was fortunately prepared and ended up having a really useful conversation on that airplane about the farm safety net. So, don't have to prepare at that level starting today, but you never know. So, just thinking through it. My name is Ariana. I'm a farmer in the district, or, whatever you are. I work with farmers in the district. I'm a member of a community supported agriculture program in the district. I am a parent in the district. I'm a student, whatever it is. And I'm calling to ask you to, and then pick your ask, co-sponsor the Ag Resilience Act or one of the marker bills we just spoke about. Or, if you're not as intimately familiar with one of the marker bills, you can just say something more general, asking you to prioritize farmers of color in the next farm bill. Support programs like the one I've used, the Conservation Stewardship Program, in the next farm bill. And then take some time to think about that story. Like, this issue matters to me because I've used this program and it was really impactful for my farm. This issue matters to me because it's really important to me to be able to access locally grown food. And the farmers in my community depend on this type of program, whatever it is. But build that story and think about why your voice matters. And if we had more time, maybe we'd sit down and write some of that together. But this can give you just a little bit of a taste because, you and your voice as an advocate, as part of our collective movement, are so important and will be the reason that this next farm bill stands any sort of chance of including progress in the direction of supporting farmers doing regenerative forms of agriculture and bringing more justice into the food system. So I will leave it there. My last slide just has my contact information. I'm happy to be in touch. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any follow-up questions. We're also about to do a question and answer, but if you'd like to connect after this, I'm always happy to do that. Thank you so much for sitting through on your lunch hour, whatever time of day it is for you, this wonky conversation about policy. I love you for it. I'm happy you're here and excited to chat in more detail. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ariana. This is just such a great version of, we need a Schoolhouse Rock of the Farm Bill, and I feel like you did you did the best that we've got of what a marker bill is and how we can all be engaged at whatever level and wherever we're coming from in the food system, because we all eat at the end of the day. So I would love to open things up to questions. We've got a really nice small group today, so if folks want to unmute and ask their questions, or if you want to use a raise hand function or just drop questions in the chat, I'm happy to field questions that way and just kind of dive in. But just a big thank you, both Lisa and Ariana, for taking the time to talk to all of us and be part of this Farm Bill series that we're building. Buck, I think you have your hand raised if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I joined a little bit late. I was on the phone, but I was on cell phone reception. So my name's Buck Jones. I'm with Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, but I'm also part of the Native Farm Bill Coalition. So we had fly-ins in Washington, D.C. with our representatives, and I appreciate you talking about the Black farmers being discriminated against. There was also a USDA case called the Keep Eagle that actually was a case for tribals being discriminated against. So I just wanted to put that out there. Tribes have a lot of priorities for the Farm Bill. SNAP and is an issue. Rural broadband is an issue. Having control of our own food programs is a priority for tribes, and actually getting more local food into our regional our food programs on our tribes, and having that control, and not relying on USDA. We can control our own sovereignty. If we can't control our own food, how sovereign are we? And then we're also doing seafood priorities as well for the Farm Bill, getting seafood into programs that are regional, when USDA did regional and culturally appropriate. When USDA did one of their commodity programs, they put in catfish in some of their commodities, and catfish ain't relevant to my people in the Pacific Northwest or in Alaska. It's just things that we think that we have control. And then I think another real high priority too is that the local food purchasing agreements, those should be continuing, like the LAMP programs. We received an LFPA, but once this LFPA is over, then we're going to be dropped off the cliff, and these should be funds that should be continuum for both states and tribes, because that is local foods within 400 miles that we can put in our food boxes and our food distribution. So I really appreciated the time, and I just wanted to get some of my priorities on. And we're still doing the work with the Native Farm Bill Coalition to get our marker bills in. I will say, it's funny you said that about on the plane ride. I was actually had on the plane ride back to Portland. Senator Merkley was on the plane, and actually I got an email through the Native Farm Bill Coalition, like, hey, we want to do a follow-up. And I showed him the email, and he's like, hey, you're going to get a hold of my staff, right? And I go, yes, sir, I'm getting a hold of your staff. And so we've had two really good follow-ups with the staff. And even though he's not in agriculture, they're a voice, and and he's like listening to our priorities, and he's really focused on some infrastructure that can help our tribal members, and actually rural broadband, because rural broadband is in the Farm Bill. You wouldn't think it would be, but it is. So I just think that I really appreciate the time and this forum, and anything that I can help with to advocate for tribal members, I will, and anything with the Farm Bill. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Buck. Yeah, I dropped the Native Farm Bill Coalition, just link to the homepage of the Native Farm Bill Coalition in the chat. But I really appreciate you, just bringing a lot of those issues to light, and shining a light on, the different kind of elements of food sovereignty that can be hopefully redressed by some of the policies that are being put forth, and the LFPA programs, the local food purchasing agreement programs that are happening across the country are a really nice thing right now, and it's exciting to think about what it could look like long term. But I really appreciate you bringing so much context to the conversation and being here today. Do we have any other questions coming up in the chat? I see that, maybe the Native Farm Bill Coalition didn't come through properly for you, Aaron, sorry. But I have a few questions of my own that we could maybe dive into, but I want to give a little bit of space to folks that maybe have questions that they're typing up, or hands that they're hoping to raise quick. So I'll give a minute for that, and then I can jump into questions that we've got. Hi, Gretchen.
Yeah, hey, great presentation. Really, really wonderful to see this. I'm actually working with Soil and Water Conservation Society, trying to address some of the Farm Bill issues. One of the things is that this is, and I forget which version of the Farm Bill is this, but basically they come up every 5 years. correct? So this is the next iteration of the Farm Bill. How much work goes on between Farm Bill years so that when we get to the point of Farm Bill year that we're ready to go? I mean, we're kind of almost behind the 8 ball right now. Supposedly they're in the middle of writing the Farm Bill. Everybody expects it to be late, but you know, how do we maintain this momentum in these non-Farm Bill years to really make fundamental changes to the food system? Because the food system is not working. It's not working for anybody. We've got hungry people and farmers are there killing each other, killing themselves. So it's really not working. What's going on between Farm Bill years? Thank you.
I love this question. Shall I take a stab and then I'll pass it to you, Lisa? Yeah, I mean, that is the question. It's great. There are lots of different pieces that happen in between Farm Bill cycles. You're right that this is a key moment. It is late if you have a brand new idea and want to get it in the next Farm Bill. It is late for that. If you have an idea that's already part of sort of the collective imagination, it's definitely not too late to get those into the Farm Bill. In between Farm Bills, our work looks like a lot of things. One piece is like implementing any wins we do get, and that takes a surprising amount of work. It's, you know, not just as simple as getting it into the legislative language, but it takes sometimes years for that to translate into a program actually happening at USDA. There's rules that come out before a program is implemented, and we often weigh in on those. And so there's like a whole set of things around implementation that end up taking a lot of our energy. Another thing, this doesn't really speak to your question around how do we solve this big crisis, but another piece of work that ends up taking a lot of energy in between Farm Bill cycles is that this gets a bit detailed, but funding for programs, some of it is mandatory and ends up just getting funded, but some funding for programs is what is authorized as like discretionary funding, meaning that Congress can choose whether they want to give extra money to a given program or even any money to a given program every year through the annual appropriations process. So being involved in that process, while it isn't as sexy, I mean, it's hard to say the Farm Bill is sexy, but it isn't even as sexy as the Farm Bill itself, is super important and critical for making sure that any wins we do get in the Farm Bill actually make it to the ground. But there are lots of other pieces of what this work looks like in the sort of off season as we sort of ramp up for the next Farm Bill. And some of it is just like the alternatives like happening, you know, lots of Farm Bill programs start as state level programs. So things that happen at sort of the local level or the state level end up in state policy. If they work at that level, that can make the case to end up advocating for them at the federal level and ending up as programs. So some of like our nutrition match programs, that's one example that, you know, happen at the state level and then get sort of replicated if they work at the federal level. So the state level policy work that many folks do can be a way to set us up for success at the Farm Bill level. And there's also a lot of work around cultivating champions. So when there are things that are working, or there are major problems that aren't working, building understanding with members of Congress that those things need attention in the next Farm Bill is really important. And so that can happen at the like lobbying advocacy type level, which anyone can be involved in, but it can also happen in other ways. Like it can look like highlighting via media, like story sharing, story gathering, getting into the sort of cultural zeitgeist that this is a big enough issue that enough people care about that radical change or even incremental change is warranted and needs to happen in the next Farm Bill. So like the spectrum of tools that we can use to move the needle is wide. It can happen, you know, at the local level, at the state level, and in sort of like other spheres like media, you know, and going beyond just the typical legislative process. There's more, but I'll stop there. Lisa, do you want to add to that?
Sure. And I think you made some really good points, Ariana. Another thing I would say, Gretchen, is that the food system works for corporate agribusiness. It works for the big money, which is one reason we have fought and fought and fought against that. So it does work. It just doesn't work for most of us. It doesn't work for eaters. It doesn't work for producers and workers and fishermen, et cetera. So I think to that end, yes, it is important to stay as developing those relationships, hounding your legislators. And if there are local FSA offices where programs might be rolled out, especially if you are producing and you have a chance to take advantage of some of those programs, getting to know those people, hounding them. It's partly, as Ariana said, it's the funding. It also is up to USDA to make sure that those programs are staffed and that the staff roll those programs out. So if there's something you're really interested in, you know what was included, watch for that and stay on top of it as best you can. And of course, one way to do that is by joining organizations, if you're not already part of Women in Food and Agriculture Network, NFFC member, where we only have member organizations, but we have a list of organizations there, and SAC and other organizations that are related to this work, because it really takes kind of hounding them sometimes. But fighting against, I mean, we've said this for obviously over 35 years. It takes almost 40 hounding politicians to stand up for real people and real farmers and real, everyone involved, humans, not corporations, not lending operations and banks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gretchen, for that question. It's just really helpful to be able to see the way the machine of all of it works, because it works at such a huge, it's really hard to even kind of wrap your head around the way that it impacts rural broadband, and it impacts SNAP, and it impacts just so many parts of our lives. It's hard to figure out how to be a part of it. So I really appreciate you both bringing it down to the levels that feel easier to understand and digest and understand for our farmers. So we're coming up at the half hour, and I want to be respectful of folks' time and leave a little bit of time to close out and do a little bit of housekeeping for that. But I would love to hear a little bit more, I guess, if other folks have any questions, to let them jump in as well. But I would love to just hear more about kind of, if folks have the time. I think Ariana mentioned this at different levels, like where is maybe the best place to be putting energy, especially right now that we're in this kind of window of really unique opportunity with the Farm Bill deadlines and all of that. Where is, like, just a person that's wanting to make a change, is energy most useful right now in Farm Bill advocacy?
I'm sorry, I guess I was kind of daydreaming. Did you say? I was reading the chat and then I realized I think there's a question there. So where to make the most use of our time right now as advocates?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I would say quickly, the bills that we've both lifted up, I think they're all good bills there. People, congressional champions that we're proud to be working with and have some really good ideas. And they need to hear from you. Your legislators need to hear from you, especially if they're on the agriculture committees. And you can find that out by going to senate.gov and looking, or house.gov, and looking up agriculture committees. And and staying on, to some degree, and sharing with your networks too, even if you're not part of an organization. If there's something that you want to take to your local farmers market, your church, gardening club, movie book club, whatever, just sharing. I think sharing that, getting that out there too, is, being silent in I think especially today with all the stuff going on is not an option right now. So thanks for being here, and thanks for all your work to make things better.
Yes, echoing that. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I mean, here's one. I just threw a link in the chat to one action opportunity to just ask your member Congress to co-sponsor the Agriculture Resilience Act. That's like one tiny example of the type of thing that this moment really calls for is, yeah, taking collective action with other folks. Here's one action many folks are taking. And I should also lift up that we are planning a week of action around climate and agriculture. That's sort of a follow-on to a major event we had this past spring. We had a rally for resilience where we had hundreds of farmers that came and marched in the streets of DC asking for action on climate in the Farm Bill. And we're planning a follow-up week of action to happen from everywhere, not a centralized in-person event in September. So if you sign up for our list, then you'll hear about that. And I imagine that might also be true if you're plugged in with WFAN.
Awesome. And Erin, did you have a question?
I just wanted to add something to that real quick. Buck mentioned that he was part of a trip that went out to DC and met with congressional staff. And if you're one of those people who happens to live in a congressional district, for someone who is on the House or Senate committee, ag committees, try to find the organizations around you. And there's a lot of them that do those trips to DC. I don't work for one anymore, but I have in the past, and I've been one of those people who takes people to DC, and I would have killed to have a group of ladies like this. I'm always having to like drag my not favorite demographic to hang out with to DC for stuff like this. But you know, definitely get involved with that kind of stuff if you can, like Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited, and those are two that just come to mind immediately, have big agricultural programs, and they're heavily tied in with the Farm Bill. And I know those two happen to have a hunting correlation with them, but there's a lot of others, and they pay for their volunteers to go out to DC to meet with staffers and actual representatives who will take the time to meet with them or other congressional staff. And it's a very rewarding process. It's exhausting, but they do listen, you know, and it does make a difference.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Erin. I appreciate, just everyone here being able to be a part of that conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you especially to Lisa and Ariana and NFFC and NSAC for being a part of this Farm Bill series. We have our next session happening Tuesday, July 11th, which will be a session focused on conservation in the Farm Bill, some of the things that Erin just mentioned of organizations like Pheasants Forever and Trout Unlimited, and talking about what conservation could look like in the 2023 Farm Bill. And I will drop a link to that calendar in the chat. And I'll also be sending out a follow-up email to you all with any relevant kind of information that came up throughout the chat. So don't feel like you have to write any of all of this down. And then I'm going to drop the recordings are live for our last session, which is the Farm Worker Rights session with Alianza Nacional de Campesinas and National Young Farmers Coalition. Those are now live on our YouTube page, and you can find the English and Spanish interpreted sessions for those on that YouTube page. Otherwise, we really appreciate you taking the time. It's a long time to sit and be on Zoom, and I appreciate everyone being here, and hope to see you again in the future, and really appreciate y'all taking the time.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you. Thank you,
everyone.
Rolando.
Thanks.
Mil gracias. Thank you, Ariana and Lisa. Thanks, you too. We'll see you on the 11th, I guess.
Again.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.